The servants could hear her screaming from 3 corridors away, not the victim, Elizabeth herself. The Countess stood in front of a cracked mirror, blood dripping down her pale arms, shrieking that she could still see a wrinkle forming at the corner of her eye. Moments later, a young girl was dragged into the chamber, begging for mercy she would never receive. Within the hour, her body would be drained, her blood collected in a copper basin, and Elizabeth Báthory, history's most notorious female killer, would lower herself into the crimson bath she believed was the secret to eternal youth. For over 400 years, people have whispered her name with horror. The Blood Countess, the woman accused of murdering more than 600 girls in her quest for beauty. But here's what most people don't realize. Behind the legend lies a far more disturbing truth. Tonight, you'll discover the chilling medical theories about her obsession, the political conspiracy that may have exaggerated her crimes, and the grotesque rituals witnesses swore under oath they saw with their own eyes. And the most shocking detail: according to court records, her final victims weren't peasants at all, but daughters of the nobility, girls whose disappearances could not be ignored. That single mistake turned her from a hidden predator into Europe's most infamous monster. Quick favor: if you've already learned something your school textbooks never dared to mention, smash that like button. It helps more people discover the suppressed history we're about to uncover. Because by the end, you won't know whether Elizabeth Báthory was the world's first female serial killer or a victim of one of history's darkest conspiracies. Elizabeth Báthory was born in 1560 into unimaginable wealth and power. Her family controlled vast estates in the Kingdom of Hungary. Her uncle was the King of Poland. Her cousin sat as Prince of Transylvania. To peasants, the Báthory name carried the weight of royalty itself, but privilege came with a price. Generations of inbreeding left the family riddled with mental illness. Relatives suffered violent rages, epileptic fits, and paranoid delusions. Elizabeth herself was said to faint without warning, then awaken in a frenzy. Even as a child, she was brilliant but unstable, able to speak multiple languages by age 10, but also prone to violent temper tantrums so severe that servants whispered she had the devil's spirit. At 11 years old, she was betrothed to Ferenc Nadasdy, a Hungarian nobleman nicknamed the Black Hero for his brutal campaigns against the Ottoman Turks. By 15, she was married in a ceremony so lavish that thousands of peasants lined the roads for miles. As part of her dowry, Elizabeth received Csejte Castle, a fortress perched on a cliff in present-day Slovakia. And it was here, behind heavy stone walls and barred windows, that the whispers of her cruelty began. Ferenc was no gentle husband. He was forged in the fire of battle, known for his ruthless tactics against enemies, and Elizabeth, barely a teenager, was expected to match him in brutality. While he rode to war, she ruled the estates, and she ruled with an iron fist. Accounts describe her as merciless with servants. A girl who dropped a piece of embroidery might be beaten until her hands were too swollen to sew again. A maid who spilled wine at dinner might be dragged outside and stripped naked in winter until frostbite blackened her skin. One story claims Ferenc himself taught Elizabeth methods of punishment. He supposedly showed her how to coat whips with honey, then drive servants into the courtyard, where insects swarmed their bleeding wounds until the victims collapsed in agony. Whether that tale is true or not, one thing is certain: cruelty became the language of their household. Yet outside the castle, Elizabeth's image remained pristine. She was admired for her education, praised for her elegance, and rumored to be one of the most beautiful women in Hungary. Visitors described her pale complexion, dark hair, and sharp cheekbones. But behind the locked doors of Csejte, screams echoed off the stone walls. According to testimony later recorded at her trial, the moment that transformed Elizabeth from cruel mistress to legendary monster happened by accident. One day, she struck a young servant girl across the face so hard that blood splattered onto her hand. As she wiped it away, Elizabeth noticed something, or at least she convinced herself she did. The skin where the blood had landed looked smoother, younger, almost glowing. In that moment, Elizabeth Báthory became convinced she had discovered the secret to eternal youth. Not herbs, not oils, not prayer, blood. Her obsession spiraled quickly. At first, she ordered her servants to collect blood drops from beaten maids, smearing it across her face like a cosmetic. Soon, she demanded basins filled with the crimson liquid, immersing herself completely. Her chambers became a slaughterhouse, with young girls lured into the castle on promises of work or safety, only to be drained and discarded. And here's the chilling detail. Elizabeth didn't act alone. She had a team. Her closest servants became accomplices, dragging victims into hidden rooms, bleeding them out, scrubbing the walls after every ritual. It was organized, systematic, industrial. By the early 1600s, rumors spread like wildfire. Peasants whispered of daughters who entered the castle and never returned. Merchants told of strange stains on the walls, the smell of iron and rot wafting from the fortress. Priests muttered about witchcraft and satanic rites. Some swore Elizabeth was no ordinary woman, but a vampire, feeding on the lifeblood of virgins to keep her beauty intact. Others believed she had made a pact with the devil himself, trading her soul for eternal youth. But the most disturbing whisper of all came from those who claimed to have seen the aftermath. According to testimony, bodies were found buried around the castle grounds, their flesh burned, their limbs broken, their faces frozen in screams. One servant later confessed under torture that Elizabeth sometimes bit her victims' flesh, tearing chunks from their shoulders or breasts. Whether she did this out of frenzy or ritual is unclear, but it painted her as less human and more monster. For years, no one dared challenge her. She was too powerful, too connected. A peasant's accusation would mean their execution, not hers. But Elizabeth made one fatal mistake. She grew bolder, her hunger expanded, and soon she wasn't just taking peasant girls. She began luring daughters of the nobility. And that, when noble blood spilled, the kingdom could no longer ignore the screams coming from Csejte Castle. By the winter of 1609, the whispers had grown too loud to ignore. For decades, Elizabeth Báthory's victims had been peasants, poor, forgotten, nameless girls. But now, daughters of nobility were disappearing. Families with influence began to demand answers. And when the noble dead started piling up, the crown could no longer turn a blind eye. But here's the disturbing part. Elizabeth didn't seem to care. According to witness testimony, she actually bragged about her methods at private gatherings, laughing, as she described tortures so brutal that hardened soldiers looked away. She believed she was untouchable. After all, she wasn't just wealthy, she was connected to kings. She underestimated just how much horror her own servants would reveal. Inside Csejte Castle, violence had become ritual. Servants testified that girls were stripped naked, beaten with iron rods until flesh split, and then forced to lie bleeding in the snow. Elizabeth sometimes shoved needles under fingernails or used scissors to slice away skin in delicate strips, as though peeling fruit. One of her favorite punishments was known as the star-kicking torture. Victims were suspended by their wrists, whipped until they collapsed, then revived with cold water, only to be beaten again. It wasn't chaos, it was a performance. Elizabeth sat in her chamber, dressed in fine silk, calmly instructing the tortures as if directing a play. And then came the blood rituals. Servants swore under oath that she collected it in basins, smearing it across her face, soaking her hands, even submerging herself entirely. One particularly chilling testimony claimed that Elizabeth once forced a servant to prepare her a bath and then slit the girl's throat over the tub, letting the warm blood cascade down like some macabre fountain. But here's what's worse. Some historians believe the stories were exaggerated under torture. And yet, enough bodies were discovered to prove that something very real and very horrifying had happened. After her husband Ference's death in 1604, Elizabeth spiraled. She had lost her only shield, the one man whose reputation kept her critics at bay. Now, with no one to restrain her, her violence escalated. Witnesses said she began luring noble girls into her castle under the pretense of offering them education or courtly training. Instead, they were never seen again. One girl, the daughter of a local minor noble, reportedly wrote a letter before she disappeared, warning her family never to send another daughter to Csejte. That letter survives in fragments, and though historians debate its authenticity, the content is chilling. She describes screams at night and the stench of rot coming from the lower chambers. By 1609, complaints were reaching the Habsburg court in Vienna, and the man tasked with investigating was none other than György Thurzo, the Palatine of Hungary, a trusted ally of the king. Thurzo knew he was walking a political tightrope. To accuse a Báthory was dangerous, but to ignore the blood-soaked rumors was even worse. Thurzo began quietly collecting testimony, and what he heard was enough to make even battle-hardened men recoil. Dozens of servants described years of cruelty, girls beaten until bones broke, flesh bitten away, corpses buried around the castle grounds. Some claimed Elizabeth forced victims to cook and eat their own flesh. Others swore she mutilated faces, cutting mouths into grotesque smiles. One servant, under interrogation, claimed Elizabeth's obsession with blood was so extreme that she sometimes drank it directly from fresh wounds. The testimonies were graphic, contradictory, and sometimes hysterical. But when Thurzo's men began digging around Csejte Castle, they found shallow graves, skeletons with broken bones, burned remains. The evidence was undeniable, but Thurzo didn't want rumors. He wanted proof. And so, on a freezing night in December 1610, he rode with armed men to storm the castle. Picture this: snow falling over the black hills of Slovakia, the castle looming like a jagged shadow against the moonlight. Torches lit the courtyard as Thurzo's men forced open the gates. Inside, the silence was broken only by the creak of iron doors and the muffled screams echoing from deep within. What they found was worse than rumor. Accounts describe half-dead girls chained to walls, their skin torn open, their bodies still bleeding, corpses piled in a corner, partially burned. A young maid, barely alive, lay on the floor with gashes across her arms, begging for death. The stench of iron and rot was overwhelming, and Elizabeth herself? She was caught in the act. According to one account, she stood over a dying girl, her hands stained crimson. Thurzo ordered her arrested on the spot. But here's the detail most history books leave out. Elizabeth was never actually tried in court. She was too powerful, too connected. To publicly put her on trial would have embarrassed the entire Hungarian nobility. Instead, her servants took the fall. 4 of Elizabeth's closest servants, Dorothea, Ilona, János, and Katerina, were dragged into court. Under interrogation, and likely torture, they confessed everything. They described how Elizabeth ordered them to procure victims, how they disposed of bodies, how she personally bathed in blood. Dorothea claimed she once saw Elizabeth bite chunks of flesh from a servant's shoulder. János admitted to burying dozens of corpses around the castle grounds. The court recorded over 300 depositions from villagers, priests, and nobles. The number of victims cited ranged from dozens to hundreds. Some said 80. Others swore it was more than 600. But here's the shocking twist. Most of the testimonies came second-hand. Villagers repeating what they had heard, servants speaking under threat of death. Was it truth or theater, designed to ensure the Countess was destroyed? In January 1611, the verdict was clear. Elizabeth's servants were executed in gruesome fashion, burned alive, their bodies torn apart. But Elizabeth herself, she escaped death. Instead, she was sealed inside her own castle. A room in Csejte was walled up, with only small openings for food and air. She would spend the next 4 years entombed within her fortress, a living ghost haunting the halls that had once echoed with screams. And when she finally died in 1614, alone in her cell, the official record claimed she passed peacefully in her sleep. But according to one local legend, when masons came to tear down the wall, they found her body blackened and shriveled, as if all the blood she had stolen had finally turned to poison. When Elizabeth Báthory was walled inside her castle in 1611, her body was trapped, but her legend was set free. And that legend grew darker with each retelling. Some claimed she killed 80 victims. Others swore it was over 600. But the truth, it's far murkier, tangled in superstition, politics, and propaganda. So what really happened? Was Elizabeth the Blood Countess, bathing in virgin's blood to preserve her youth? Or was she a wealthy, powerful woman destroyed by men who feared her influence? The answer, as always, lies somewhere between horror and conspiracy. One of the most shocking claims in her trial was the number of victims, 650. That would make Elizabeth the most prolific serial killer in recorded history. But here's the strange part. Those numbers don't come from direct evidence. They come from one servant's testimony, where a maid claimed to have seen a ledger listing hundreds of names. That ledger was never produced. Historians believe the number may have been wildly exaggerated to shock the court and justify her punishment. Modern estimates suggest her victims may have been closer to 80 or 100, a staggering number, but nowhere near 650. And when you remember that much of the testimony was collected under torture, the truth becomes even harder to pin down. Let's address the most infamous part of her legend: bathing in blood. Here's the strange thing. Contemporary trial records never mention it. Not once. The idea that Elizabeth literally submerged herself in blood only appeared in stories written decades, even centuries later. So where did it come from? Likely from the culture of the time. In the early 18th century, a Jesuit priest began retelling Elizabeth's story in sermons, adding lurid details to paint her as a cautionary tale about vanity and sin. Over time, those details hardened into fact. By the 19th century, writers in the Romantic and Gothic movements had seized on her story. Elizabeth Báthory was transformed from a cruel noblewoman into a vampiric monster, a real-life Dracula in a dress. The legend was more profitable, more shocking, more unforgettable than the messy truth. But there's another angle, one often overlooked. Elizabeth Báthory wasn't just any noblewoman. She was one of the wealthiest landowners in Hungary, controlling vast estates that many men in power coveted. When her husband died, Elizabeth's wealth and influence remained enormous. She was effectively a widow, running her own empire in a deeply patriarchal society. And that made her a problem. Some historians argue that her downfall was orchestrated by rivals, including György Thurzo, the very man who arrested her. By accusing her of monstrous crimes, her estates could be seized and redistributed. And that's exactly what happened. It's a chilling possibility that Elizabeth's story was exaggerated, maybe even fabricated, not because she was innocent, but because her guilt was too convenient. Think about it. In the early 1600s, noblemen routinely killed peasants without consequence. Warlords burned villages, soldiers massacred innocents, and no one called them monsters. But when a woman, a wealthy, educated, politically connected woman, was accused of cruelty, the world erupted in outrage. It's not to excuse Elizabeth's crimes. Even if she killed only dozens, that alone makes her one of the most brutal women in history. But the hysteria surrounding her, the bloodbath myths, the 600 victims tally, those details smell more like propaganda than fact. It was easier for the nobility to paint her as a supernatural vampire than to admit they were threatened by a woman who held more land and money than most of them combined. This is where history bleeds into folklore. In the centuries after her death, Elizabeth's story fused with the vampire myths of Eastern Europe. Villagers whispered that she still haunted the ruins of Csejte Castle. Some swore they saw her ghost wandering the halls, drenched in blood. Others claimed her spirit lured young girls into the forest, never to be seen again. Writers in the 18th and 19th centuries embellished these tales. Elizabeth became a symbol of vanity, a cautionary tale for women who valued beauty too highly. Gothic authors seized on her as the perfect villainess, wealthy, seductive, bathing in blood to cheat death. By the time Bram Stoker published Dracula in 1897, Elizabeth Báthory was already woven into the DNA of vampire legend. She was the female counterpart to Vlad the Impaler, another historical figure distorted into a monster for centuries of entertainment. Modern historians and forensic experts have tried to separate fact from fiction. The evidence they agree on is chilling enough. Dozens of bodies buried or hidden around Csejte Castle. Eyewitness accounts of beatings, torture, and mutilation. But the rest, the basins of blood, the 600 victims, the ritualistic baths, remains uncertain. Was Elizabeth a deranged sadist who discovered her own perverse beauty regimen? Or a cruel noblewoman whose reputation was exaggerated by enemies eager to erase her legacy and steal her land? Either way, the horror is undeniable. Innocent girls vanished into her castle and never returned. Their screams were real. Their graves are real. Whether Elizabeth bathed in blood or simply spilled it, the cruelty of her reign is beyond dispute. After her arrest, Elizabeth never saw freedom again. For 4 years, she was sealed inside a bricked-up chamber in her own castle, with only small slits for food and air. She spent her final years in darkness, cut off from the world. On August 21st, 1614, guards found her lifeless body on the floor. Official records claimed she died peacefully in her sleep, but local legends say her corpse was blackened and shriveled, as if her stolen youth had finally abandoned her. Her body was quietly buried, her grave unmarked. To this day, no one knows exactly where she lies. Some say the villagers, furious at her crimes, dug up her coffin and burned her remains. Others believe her bones still rest somewhere in secret, beneath the soil of a forgotten churchyard. And that is why Elizabeth Báthory remains a ghost that refuses to die. History may debate whether she was guilty of bloodbaths or simply of cruelty, but folklore has already decided. To the world, she is the Blood Countess, the female Dracula, the monster who bathed in blood to cheat death. But here's the question. Why does her legend still terrify us today, 4 centuries later? Elizabeth Báthory has been dead for over 400 years. Her bones, wherever they lie, have long since turned to dust. And yet, her name refuses to rest. She is invoked in whispers as the Blood Countess, remembered not as a widow or noblewoman, but as the monster who murdered hundreds of girls to preserve her beauty. The truth may be blurred by propaganda and superstition, but the legacy is undeniable. Elizabeth Báthory became more than a woman. She became a symbol, a warning, a horror story, and, disturbingly, a kind of dark celebrity. Why? Because her story touches the deepest fears we carry. Fear of aging, fear of vanity, fear of power abused without mercy. When Bram Stoker published Dracula in 1897, most readers knew of Vlad the Impaler, the warlord, whose cruelty inspired the vampire count. But just as important, though often uncredited, was Elizabeth Báthory. She was the female counterpart to Dracula, aristocratic, elegant, beautiful, and terrifying. Where Vlad's cruelty came from war, hers came from obsession. Where he drank blood, she bathed in it. Both blurred the line between historical truth and Gothic fiction, until myth swallowed fact. In Gothic literature of the 18th and 19th centuries, Báthory became a recurring villainess. She was the perfect archetype, a wealthy noblewoman whose vanity turned to sadism. Sermons painted her as a warning to women, while horror writers depicted her as the archetype of female monstrosity. And the myth was irresistible. Even if she had never bathed in blood, people wanted her to, because the story was too shocking, too grotesque, too unforgettable to let go. As horror evolved into modern entertainment, Elizabeth's legend followed. Silent films in the early 20th century hinted at her story, casting her as a vampiric countess in shadowy castles. By the 1970s, European exploitation cinema embraced her fully. Films like Countess Dracula reimagined Elizabeth as a noblewoman literally rejuvenated by bathing in virgin's blood. The imagery was lurid, shocking, and wildly popular. Even mainstream Hollywood couldn't resist. Echoes of Elizabeth appear in countless vampire films, TV shows, and novels. From American Horror Story Hotel, where Lady Gaga's character is directly inspired by Báthory, to modern video games and graphic novels, the Blood Countess is everywhere. She has become a pop culture icon, not a dusty figure in a history book, but an immortal character who resurfaces every time a new generation wants to be horrified. Why does her story still terrify us? It's not just the blood, it's what it represents. At its core, Elizabeth's legend is about the obsession with youth and beauty. 400 years later, that obsession hasn't gone away. We may not bathe in blood, but we inject toxins, undergo surgeries, smear our faces with chemicals, promising eternal youth. The idea of a woman so desperate to stay beautiful that she murdered hundreds resonates because it feels like an extreme reflection of our own world. It also speaks to something darker, the abuse of power. Elizabeth was untouchable. She controlled lives with a gesture. In a time when peasants were disposable, she turned their bodies into fuel for her vanity. The horror isn't supernatural. It's human cruelty magnified by privilege. And finally, there's the forbidden allure. People are fascinated by the grotesque, drawn to stories of cannibalism, vampirism, and taboo rituals. Elizabeth embodies all of it: sex, death, blood, vanity, in one unforgettable figure.